course of events, ordered on Tuesday, September 29th, sent on Wednesday, September 30th, received on Saturday, October 3rd, consumed on Saturday, October 3rd, around 3 p.m. John was very close to Brian and has been very depressed ever since, until he saw an online forum. John had thought that it was all his fault, but he certainly feels less guilty now that he knows it was a bad batch. I trust John completely. He is extremely intelligent and always does his research. I knew something was wrong when I started to feel the intensity. John would have never given me a starting dose that was that strong. I was expecting it to recede, but it kept on getting more intense, and that is when reality went completely away. I was in my room, walking back and forth from the bed to the bathroom. John would check on me, but I could not handle human contact, and he said Brian was having a rough time, so I sent him away. Light was way too intense for me, and so was closing my eyes. My cat scared the hell out of me. I just wanted it to be over. I almost asked to be taken to the hospital, but I figured that it was just going to pass. But it didn't. I soon went over the edge and found myself at the point where I was crawling on the floor in every direction, only to find I was alone in a psychedelic universe. I was the center of this universe, and no matter which direction, to whom or what I crawled, I was stuck. This universe was strange. I was the queen. I was everything, but I was not allowed knowledge. The voices of the universe told me that I was the center, and I was not allowed to know everything. It seemed to follow a circular pattern. Eventually, I landed on my back. I'd given up. I saw visions of my boyfriend's father standing over me trying to help, but the universe made him disappear, only to be replaced by an EMT injecting me with an IV drip. I felt that the universe was pleased by this, and all I can tell it back in repetition was, obnoxious. Yet something about it felt good and right, so the words seemed to come out of me seductively. Next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital, completely wired up to health monitoring machines and a catheter. I was still having some visuals, but very minor. I can tell that they had given me some sort of sedative because I felt foggy. I kept falling asleep and waking up. In one of my waking moments, a nurse had told me that John was being difficult, but she did not mention Brian. Then I overheard the nurses and a police officer talking. It was about 3 people. One of them had died. I was hoping it was not about me, John, and Brian. It was only hours later that I found out that they were. John and I were discharged from the hospital Sunday around 11 a.m. We went home and the house felt too cold for me. We have this courtyard thing near the front door, so all afternoon Sunday I took naps in the courtyard. I was hungry, but I found it hard to go in the house. It felt bitterly cold, and trust me, I know what cold is. Eventually the sun went down and I could not bear the hunger pains no more, so I went inside. I loved Brian. The relationship that he had with John made me jealous. I wish I was closer to my sister, who is the same age as Brian. I had the easier childhood than John and Brian, but Brian and John's lousy childhood made John's bond to Brian stronger, I think. Even though Brian was only John's half-brother, same mother, their relationship was very strong. Since Brian was at a young age, he was transferred back and forth from his mother to his father. It was a bad situation. While Brian was at their mother's house, John played the role of a male role model. John taught him how to read, how to fight, and how to be a man. John felt that he had lost a son, and before he had said that, I had felt it too. The whole thing has been hard for John, until he realized that it was not his fault. Thanks to the online forum, giving us the information that it was not pure 2CB fly. Brian's death will not be in vain. He will live on in the people that see the post about him and decide to test their stuff and realize it's not what it appears to be. Sorry for this rambling, I haven't slept well. Thank you again, many, many times over. P.S. John spoke with their mother this morning, and she said that the toxicologist said that it was just a tainted batch. I ate 7 seeds of Datura. They didn't taste too bad for being seeds. I expected a lot worse, as I am used to my monthly dose of morning glory. 1,500 seeds. 20 minutes in. I feel every mile per hour that the earth spins. Ghosts of dead people have lined up at my front door, and the line goes on for miles. I can only imagine that I am looking at the ghost of every single person who has ever died. I am unaware that this is only the beginning of the trip, but my oh my, I was in for a ride. Approximately 45 minutes in. This is when I lost track of time. After conversing with many of the spirits who had come to visit me, they all seemed to disappear in an instant. Curious as to what happened, I went outside to see where everyone had went. I obviously didn't realize this at the time, but to anyone onlooking, I was just a crazy man on his front porch screaming for his friends to come back at 2 in the afternoon. After I had forgotten why I had gone outside, I decided to go back to inside, but somehow I had gotten lost. Everything around me started to look like some odd and grotesque jungle of meat and bones. It is as if I had been digested by a zombie and was now living on its flesh. I began to panic. I was sweating profusely, and I felt like I was in an ocean. Now, either I was hallucinating this badly, or a couple of hours had gone by because I can see that the streetlights were turned on. After I noticed this, everything started to look more normal. Well, as normal as things would look for being on Datura. Now I started to get my bearings. I was still in my front yard, just stuck inside of the bushes that line in the front of my house. As I pulled myself together, I managed to make it back inside. This is when things started to go bad. Time really did go forward, because my parents got home. In order to make things look as natural as possible, I went into my room and turned some music on. Sometime later, I heard a knock on the door. My heart sunk as I was clearly not in the mindset to talk to anyone. My dad opened the door and began screaming, and that was not the worst. As it turns out, before I went outside and gotten stuck, I stripped completely naked and pissed all over the floor. It took only a moment for my father to realize I was still naked, and he grabbed me by the shoulder and started hitting me. When he was done, he threw clothes at me and told me to get dressed, and when I sobered up, to come up to talk to him. Fearing for my life, I put my clothes on and then proceeded to open my window and escape. This meant jumping from the 2nd story. I do not know how I did not end up seriously injured. I must have been guided by some supernatural spirit, but I jumped out the window and decided to make my next move. My girlfriend only lived about 5 minutes away from me, so I thought that it might be a good idea to go there. Well, showing up to your girlfriend's house unannounced while tripping as hard as rock is not a good idea. I did not know how insane I looked, but neither she nor her parents seemed very happy to see me. I don't know exactly what she was saying to me as I was still stunned from my father's beating, but I knew it was not good. She basically kicked me out and we have not spoken since. My trip started to become a nightmare. It must have been after 10 p.m. because it was almost pitch black outside except for the streetlights. It seemed as if around every corner there was a shadow waiting to take my soul to the grave. Everything in my peripheral seemed like it was moving closer and closer to me. As I got more afraid, I started to move faster. Eventually I was sprinting down the street running faster than I ever run before. Running felt good. Dopamine and endorphins were coursing through my veins. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. The streetlights were still shining brightly, but the world around me seemed to be light as day. Turns out, all I needed to do was get some good old exercise. I decided to keep walking and eventually ended up at a park that was a few miles away from my house. I was so tired, and although I couldn't sleep, I remember what happened while I was closing my eyes. However, I believe it must have been a wonderful time. I woke up sometime later the next night. I did not have a phone or watch on, so I do not know how long it was. I made up my mind to stay at the park for a few days, and I just hid in the woods so no one would know I was there. I ate food that I would steal from the local Giant Eagle and drank water at the public drinking fountain that was at the park. Well, Datura is something else, man. See ya, folks. In November 2016, I was invited to partake in the ceremonial drinking of ayahuasca where I reside in Canada. It was 2 ceremonies, both conducted under an ayahuasquero who had trained with the well-known Peruvian Shipibo shaman. I had researched ayahuasca for several years and had read many positive reviews of people healing or moving through blocks in life. I had not read or even seen anything regarding the risk of negative outcomes or the development of psychological disorders post-use. I had a fairly healthy life, didn't do any other drugs besides the occasional marijuana edible. I wasn't on any medications. I had some anxiety and depression over the course of my life, but never needing to be medicated. I was very curious about this medicine and took the offer when invited, and I made sure to ask if only there were 2 plants being used, chacruna and capi, which they said yes. The day came and there were about 8 of us attending. The other attendees were doctors, counselors, and other health professionals, which added to my sense that there weren't any major risks associated with it. I followed the diet regimen and preparatory guidelines. The first ceremony was interesting. I was happy. I had many visuals that were interesting. Most I didn't understand, like alien creatures that all seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere. I saw a snake. It was distant from me and seemed to be checking me out but never coming near. Then towards the end of the ceremony, something shifted. I started to feel a heaviness come over me, and then a primal fear. Was I dying? I began to feel grotesque, and my surroundings took on a darker tone. Death and rot. I began to panic and ask for help. The shaman came over and sung an Aikaro, and I let out a deep-rooted purge that seemed to be coming from the very depth of my bowels. Instantly, the panic and grotesque sensations disappeared. More relaxed, I lay there and drifted off to sleep. The next day, I felt okay, but there was slight anxiety that had surfaced. I let the shaman know I was feeling different, a little off with anxiety. She said it was okay to proceed with the next ceremony and that I needed more work. The evening came and the second ceremony began. I drank the brew and lay on my mat and waited. Within 25 minutes, I began to feel an intense surge of anxiety. I had not been thinking about anything, just calmly waiting for the effects to take place. The anxiety grew in magnitude and became so intense I was having a hard time being still. Then I went into flight or fight response. My heart was racing. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through me. I was panicking. I felt like I needed to leave. I jumped up from my mat and ran out of the room. I felt like I was going insane. I couldn't calm myself. I went outside to the porch hoping the air would do me some good, but it didn't. I wanted to jump off the porch to flee. I've never felt this intense of anxiety in my life. Someone from the group came out and checked on me. They saw the distress I was in and coaxed me back into the ceremonial space. The shaman did some work on me, and after some time, I was beginning to settle down and laid back on my mat. Then some visuals started. They all had a dark tone. I began to have auditory hallucinations. I heard someone speaking to me. The voice was saying things like, "You don't even believe yourself." Paranoia set in. I tried to surround myself with love, but everything good seemed to melt away. I started to feel distant from everything, lonely and hopeless. Then the grotesque, rotten death feeling started to surface again. I was feeling like I was dying. My body was heavy and limp. My hands and arms looked pale and ghastly. I was in a state of freeze and felt a fear that no human should ever feel. My surroundings looked like I was in some kind of death lodge, with suffering all around me. The visuals turned to static, and I started to feel like I had lost my mind. I kept getting up and going outside in an attempt to ground myself and breathe in the air while wishing the night was over. And finally, it was. The next morning, I woke up feeling disoriented. I was pretty shaken up by the experience, but glad it was over. I spoke to the shaman about what I had experienced. They said I would start to feel better and that I had been releasing traumas. 3 days after ceremony is when I became psychologically unwell. It started with panic attacks, body tremoring, nightmares, and surges of intense anxiety. I also had intense ear ringing with noise sensitivity. I couldn't sleep or eat. Then the flashbacks started. I was re-experiencing the grotesque feeling and primal fear. I became more and more unwell. Unable to cope, I was admitted for a few days in emergency psychological services in an acute stress response. They put me on benzos and sent me home. As the days went on, I did not recover. I had to take a leave from my job as I could no longer work. I continued to experience flashbacks, panic attacks, insomnia, extreme startle response, and noise sensitivity. I couldn't go into crowds or drive, and had a hard time talking with people. I started to see a psychiatrist who had experience with psychedelic drugs and research. After 4 months of dealing with these symptoms, I was diagnosed with psychedelic-induced PTSD. It has been a year and I have not gotten much better. In fact, some days I feel worse than my initial reaction. I continue to suffer on a daily basis with panic attacks, hallucinations, severe anxiety, and agitation. I have tried a number of therapies and medications, but so far have not recovered. I just pray to recover from this. It had truly been a harrowing experience. I was placed on an antipsychotic and my symptoms have gone away. I do have to continue to take the meds daily or symptoms return. I do have a better functioning life now. Will be hopefully returning to work. PTSD versus psychosis. it is hard to know what has incurred from my ayahuasca experience. So I'm living in an old farmhouse with my kids. This was when my hip deformities really went south and my pain became constant. Back then, I was very anti-opiate, so my doctor and I thought if I could just sleep through the night, handling my pain during the day would be easier. I'd take my first ever pill and go to sleep. Apparently, a bat woke me up. We did have bats in the house now and then. My kids found me trying to catch the bat, crying about how cute he was and he was going to be my friend, and eat all the mosquitoes and bugs in my room for me. I was eventually disarmed of the bat, released outside without incident, and I didn't get bit, and told in no uncertain terms to go back to sleep, which I was rather salty about. But then, my son got up to go pee and heard a buzzing noise in the bathroom. He found me crouched on the sink like a gremlin, naked, tattooing earrings on my ears, just like black dots up each ear, like multiple piercings. I apparently attempted to fend him off with the tattoo gun, but was once again quarreled and sent to bed. But not before attempting to escape to find my bat, naked. Thank God the kids were old enough to take me down, and we lived in the country with only one close-ish neighbor. In the morning, I got to hear the tale, check out my new tats, fix the shitty job I had done, and then return the rest of the prescription to be disposed of at the pharmacy. But why? They wanted to know. I showed them my ears, told them about my friend the bat, and my poor kids having to block the door so nude mommy didn't go herring off into the night to find her bat friends. Fucking sleep aids. Never again. Now I just accept I don't sleep for longer than 4 hours, and I nap a lot. Much less crazy.